Hello everyone, this is your second placed gamer here, more like a dedicated forum dweller. This is part 4 of my deeper analysis regarding the current crisis of Diablo 4. Itemization. So finally, the always hot topic when it comes to games of this kind. First of all, let me introduce to the conceptual principles when it comes to criticism in part 1. We should judge the game as if it's only one unique thing, first of its kind. That does not mean that we cannot use already known methods and principles to improve it, but bear with me for a second here. Principle number 1. Diablo 4 itemization should fit Diablo 4, not having some copy-pasted stuff from other games and simply glued on. Principle number 2. Do nothing until knowing exactly what doesn't work, i.e. change only what frustrates players playing the game for longer. Principle number 3. Identify which parts of the current itemization system shouldn't endure changes, and for those that do, try to find the least sledgehammer-like approach so we have a little side effects as possible. Having all that due diligence will help. However, it will not necessarily be enough to come with concrete solution examples. However, we'll do our attempt near the end and post the results. Now, before we start with the part of identifying what's wrong, I'll briefly post a note of assumption. I'll do the itemization bits assuming that nearing Season 2, the affix mechanics and their influence by image buckets problems are properly balanced. That being said, what are the biggest problems of Diablo 4 itemization? Well, I think I may have noticed some of them. Problem number 1, the gambling addiction problem, i.e. the attempt to fine-tune your already relatively good gear. Well, gotta admit this is perhaps and might be a bit of sledgehammer here, but I think the biggest reason for that gambling addition of expensive sessions at rerolls at vendors is precisely the notion of absolutely constant, i.e. set in stone inherent values on items. For example, if there is a chance in amulet to roll an inherent value of movement speed, chances are you will not gamble for it at good amulets time and time again to see that if RNG gods reward you for a movement speed slot. The gambling process IMO can be approved as well, namely give us 3 choices as opposed to 2. And no, I don't think that the cost in that case would be too high. However, I want to briefly emphasize one additional benefit to adding some variety to those inherent rolls in the items, namely the low but still existing ability to have a higher tier or higher rank roll that will carry the almost entire weight for the item. Problem number 2. Itemization tier progression stops at level 70 or somewhere around there. In other words, you keep getting the same affixes over and over for 30 levels straight at the end. I think that I probably already mentioned this one in part 1, right? It is a bit similar problem with the one we just mentioned with the gambling addiction. However, the actual steps to resolve this one are slightly different. Now, perhaps I wouldn't be providing this one extra point below if it wasn't for my, let's say, personal Barber hearts problem, i.e. injection of absolutely secondary lightsaber stuff. Problem number 3. Guidelines of how to avoid creating another. Before going on an analysis to what has worked well in some other games, namely Diablo 2, I'll kind of briefly mention that Diablo 4 itemization, or at least set of affixes that roll in it, aren't that as bad as criticized. Namely, all those conditionals in the game could be frustrating at times, but that is actually yet another proof of my assumption that Diablo 4 has even more designed of those Doom Eternal-esque features like buffs and power-ups aren't permanent but rather calculated in real time, based on position and target status. I mean, yes, there are jokes regarding doing damage to a target affected by chickenpox and more than 38% Celsius fever. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in Season 2, but that is something that I personally like about the game and would be ashamed to get removed from. Might be in the minority though. but think there are a bit too much of this Doom Eternal-esque element in the game for it to become a typical RPG all out of a sudden. But back to my point regarding itemization. IMO, Diablo 4 does not have better itemization core, at least for the most part. The problem with it, in my opinion, is that it's unfinished and lacks that extra layer of specialization on top. We'll talk about it more down below, but for now I wanna make a statement that don't think adding more uniques or new categories of items such as sets or runwoods would fix it. The adjustments have to come from the inside, changing the pool of affixes that roll on items somewhat, and then moving from there on forward. A few moments ago I promised that we'll use some Diablo 2 itemization principles to implement some ideas in Diablo 4. We're going to do that, but first we have to decide what Diablo 2 did so well that even today's standards it's perhaps the highest bar ever set when it comes to itemization. In other words, if someone were to ask me, "Hey Lostariel, what is the one single thing absolutely obvious that Diablo 2 did better seemingly than all other games?" I must say that until recently I wouldn't have had the answer, but think I actually do have it now. Simplicity. Not the kind of simplicity in providing as little as possible choices, not at all, but rather the notion that each of those choices provided there is no BS behind and no chaos. i.e., if a choice is provided, it will be condensed and offered as such to the player in as little possible outcomes, and none of them will make you feel like as you've been trolled. In other words, Diablo 2 is perhaps what I would describe the most quote-unquote anti-gradient game ever, where simply you will never find percentages where they aren't required. A 13% of CC or 21% slow reduction does not exist in Diablo 2. 28% damage increase to this or that, none again, no percentages other than resistances when they aren't required. When Diablo 2 instead in reality often provide these switches, a 2-state switch, 3-state switch, 4-state switch if you like, or even simply an on-off switch to the player. There wasn't 18% poison reduction, it was a 4-state switch of half and either of the quarters. There wasn't a 22 less freeze, it was cannot be frozen or half. There was no 30% less healing from mobs, it was prevent monsters heals entirely or none. There was no 15% armor penetration, it was either ignore all of it or none. That is what Diablo 2 did that stood out more and apparently stood out against the test of time. Before getting back and trying to fix Diablo 4 itemization, I'll briefly point out the personal notion of mine. The irony is that affixes in Diablo 2 that people tend to cherish and value the most, like faster cast rate and faster hit recovery, I think the game would have worked even better without. Having a single affix stand out so much more than everything else was perhaps one of the very few mistakes, in my opinion, that Diablo 2 may have done. Now, let's go back with this newly reacquired knowledge, i.e. the Diablo 2 secret sauce if you like, and try it on Diablo 4. But, before we do that, let's do a bit of cleanup first. And I think that is important. People, especially those that play a lot, tend to value the so-called loot hunt for perfection, but ironically, I think the much bigger and greater reason to why Diablo 2 itemization system was so good, it was due to the low rolls, i.e. the floors being good enough, and therefore cleaning up the noise and gibberish to reduce the chances of making the players feeling less trolled in Diablo 4 affixes would do the better justice rather than just add stuff on top. Speaking of that notion of being or not trolled, quote unquote, by the game, I'll suggest one extra note here. Introduce a bit of smart roll. No, I don't think smart loot like Diablo 3, where all you get is only strength or intelligence or a character, but rather the notion of having those quote unquote paired affixes to actually higher chance roll synergistically better. For example, if you just got an affix with shock skill damage, increase the chance to get lightning rather than cold or fire. In my opinion, having those paired affixes having to roll higher numbers would be an RNG enough. But let's go now to our Diablo 4 affix cleanup. 1. Remove really bad affixes that are for one build and one class only, or bonuses that happen too rare or not relating to anything else in particular. Yes, you know what I mean, on elite kill and shrine buff direction. Now sure, we could just upgrade those to a better state and less trolling, such as on overpower, on using cooldown, or an activation of barrier, or make the shrine buff duration affect all of your buff durations. But I would still prefer having this removed for the sake of those doing the rolls and rolling gambling sessions and the vendor. 2. Remove really weak and marginal affixes that pollute the affix pool. A simple prime example of an affix that makes you feel like being trolled, quote unquote. Controlled impaired duration increase or reduction. Namely, a build that would benefit, 13% slow duration, or the times that 13% slow and fear duration reduction has saved your life. 3. Consider combining things where they can be combined. Yes, I'm looking at combining poison, bleeding, burning into one affix named suffering. And the reason why is because, as far as I know, the current implementation of all this is the same. More damage to or less damage taken from, and since there is no difference of effect, there is no point in separating them. Now the part that you may have been expected for the concrete affixes, but let me first show you a few screens just doing the point number 1 from above in letting those inherent roles differ. Now, as you may notice, I might have cheated a bit with higher numbers. That is because I think the baseline damage of items in Diablo 4 scales a bit too much. It should have a higher damage pie coming from the inherent roles instead. And right at the end, let me show you a couple of screens that came up with by implementing the more on-off switch logic rather than percentages, i.e. implementing the above mentioned principles from Diablo 2. So, what do you think? Does this look like doing the game justice enough? Now, I don't think that we did as much of a good job giving concrete examples. After all, creating a good itemization requires skill and dedication. However, I do think that we pointed out important guidelines, at least most of them. Let me know in the comments below if you want. That's it for now. Could bring the entire summary once again of all we came up with in the process of creating these videos. However, sadly, think I'll have to redirect you back again through the whole gauntlet of watching the 3 previous parts. I truly hope that Season 2 brings us the joy and excitement as well as balanced and dynamic gameplay that we all long and love. Thank you for watching, and if you like the video, please give it a like, subscribe, more like don't, I won't be active enough, share, and etc. See you again until next time.